conflict analysis, you look at actors, you look at arm strength, etc., etc. But I think at the end of the day, those quantitative figures do matter, especially when you're talking about decommissioning of weapons and combatants. But otherwise, to get to the root of the problem, it's really their narrative that you must read. It's how they are actually framing their issues and how you can get into that frame and be able to significantly put in some of your frames into it, your party's frames into it, rather than just simply imposing your frame on them, right? I mean, the best way to be understood by them, in fact, is to use their own language, is to use their own stories, because then they connect more easily.
That's Miriam Coronel-Ferrer speaking about discourse analysis as a means to get to the root of conflict. Miriam is a professor of political science at the University of Philippines Diliman and headed the Government of Philippines panel in peace talks with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which culminated in the signing of a peace accord in 2014. Miriam is the first female chief negotiator in the world to sign a final peace accord with a rebel group. She was a member of the United Nations standby team of senior mediators, during which she provided mediation support to UN missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Maldives, Kosovo, Georgia, Southeast Asia, among others. Miriam is also the recipient of numerous awards, including the 2015 Hillary Rodham Clinton Award for advancing women in peace and security. I'm your host, Warren Hoffman, and in this episode of Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, Miriam takes us behind the scenes of the negotiation process between the government of the Philippines and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Topics covered include the negotiation planning process, building trust between negotiation parties, how the international community can assist with power imbalances between negotiation parties, the importance of being culturally sensitive, the use of multiple tables and breaks during the negotiation process, the role of a facilitator opposed to a mediator in negotiations, the strategies and dynamics of a well-functioning negotiation team, considerations for religious beliefs in negotiations, crash course on discourse analysis, the importance of inclusivity in the negotiation process, and much more.
This is Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, podcast of the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation.
Hi, Miriam. Thanks a lot for joining me.
Hi, Warren. Happy to be with you here tonight.
Wonderful.
Today.
Yes. Thanks for joining me so late at night. It's early here and late there, so much appreciated. Now, you have a number of accolades and accomplishments, but I'd like to start with the negotiations between the government of the Philippines and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. You're the world's first ever female chief negotiator to sign a final peace agreement with a rebel group. And this was a long-standing, multi-generational conflict. Can you give us a brief overview of the conflict and describe how you felt when you were given the role of the chief negotiator?
Well, the conflict is sort of a very classic case of a segment of the population, the minority population, very far from the national center, the capital, political, economic, social capital, feeling alienated and not really being part of the historical evolution of what has become the Republic of the Philippines after colonial rule from Spaniards to U.S. American colonialism. And that kind of differentiation and discrimination felt, plus the fact that a lot of settlement migration has happened, leading to dispossession of land, has really created that sense of not belonging to the Filipino nation. So it started out really as a separatist group wanting to establish a separate republic, but part of the negotiations have been precisely to scale down that ultimate, demand to a workable arrangement where self-determination could be realized not through externals self-determination, but within the parameters of the same Philippine state. And that's what we basically set forth in our agreement, the creation of meaningful autonomous region for the people who have called themselves the Bangsa Moro, or the Moro Nation.
So when you were assigned, in your opinion, did it seem to you like the conflict was ripe and it was a good moment to be stepping in?
There were several opportunities in the past, but somehow it's sort of been produced, the kind of arrangements that would have sustained, all of the claims about the issue, including for instance, the fact that there were other claimants to the area. This area saw series of migration, which already constricted the actual area where still a majority population, Muslim population resides. So there was quite strong resistance from the neighboring provinces that had over the century been transformed because of the influx of migration from other parts of the country. Mostly settlers from Luzon and the Visayas, mostly of a different faith, and basically having taken over much of the political institutions in the claimed homeland of the Bangsamoro, which is Mindanao, along with the Sulu archipelago. But that was not whether it was ripe or not, I think there were serious attempts under the previous presidents to really find a good solution, but it just takes a long time to really come to terms with all the difficult issues. And indeed, from one president to other, there have actually been changes in policies. Some presidents actually tried to go back to war, but you did have, even before President Simeon Benigno Aquino III, who was the president at the time when he signed the agreement, some of them actually tried to do it, but just couldn't swing it yet with the kind of fairly acceptable set of resolution. And when I say acceptable, I'm referring to acceptability not only on the part of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, but also acceptability before the general public, acceptability within the confines of the Constitution of the Philippines, because we did face serious threats about, threats of being considered unconstitutional and so on, but somehow we survived that. In earlier attempts, that wasn't the case. We did have a serious Supreme Court decision that invalidated an agreement that was to be signed sometime in 2008. That meant that really there were really parameters in which a good solution that could pass the test would have to be met. And somehow we did that. We did that with the terms that we've arrived at under the comprehensive agreement.
Let's back up for a moment. What sort of preparations did you make before going into this? Can you describe that process for you?
Well, we came in the last lap, and maybe that's why we get much of the honor. But the negotiations have been going on for 17 years. I think we have to give credit to the fact that a ceasefire agreement was forged way back in 1997, and that was a very important component, at least in our process. It's not sort of de rigueur that the ceasefire should precede the political negotiations, although that sounds more intuitive, but you have had cases where a ceasefire was not in place and still an agreement was reached. Notably, for instance, in Colombia, in the peace negotiations with the FARC, right? They didn't have a ceasefire when they actually completed the agreement in 2016. In our case, that ceasefire provided some kind of a very good foundation for the whole process. So when we were coming in, we were looking at that whole process. We sort of had to review it. And that was exactly the president's injunction when our team was formed. We have to learn from the mistakes of the past, learn from the lessons in previous phases of negotiations, not only with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, but also with the mother organization, the Moro National Liberation Front, with whom another peace agreement had actually been forged. So we were actually trying to build this agreement onto that agreement. And the other injunction from the president was that we couldn't commit to anything that we couldn't implement, and that we implement what we commit to. So that really meant that on the part of government, all of these things had to be studied. Numbers crunching had to be done. When you talk about enhancing the the development potential of the region. When you talk about actually empowering them through fiscal autonomy, there was a lot of matters pertaining to financing, revenues, and so on that had to be discussed, and all of this was studied. So that's a lot of preparation really on the technical side. I mean, when you talk about the technical side, especially coming from the government, you have to take into account all the considerations of government. It's not just the political considerations, there will be the administrative and basically, all of these technicalities, including legalities that had to be taken into account. So we're actually doing a lot of negotiations with government and the different government agencies to really come up with viable proposals. President also said that we shouldn't propose to him anything that we had not vetted to the official involved. So that meant that we were really doing this kind of groundworking on all matters, transportation, telecommunications, because these are all part of the parameters of how power will be shared or divided between an autonomous region and the central government. So that's how it was, a lot of preparation, a lot of meetings. But there was also, of course, the other side to that, which was really building that kind of relationship that would establish the trust and confidence in the whole process. And certainly that was very important too.
Yeah. A large part of the preparation phase, you were already considering implementation. You're looking that far ahead. Is that right?
Maybe somewhere in the middle, but in the beginning, we had to have a proposal to the president, something that he would find viable.
Yeah.
So, and something that will meet halfway, meet the other side halfway. And government was coming from different directions. There were different levels of appreciation. I think it was good that the president had a better understanding, and it was really serious. It was really serious to find a good solution. So, in fact, it still took time to get to a proposal that we were going to submit to the other side, because it had to go through that consensus building within government and then the final say of the president. So implementation, of course, as soon as we were able to maybe finish halfway of the kinds of things that we were discussing, we had to do 4 annexes: power sharing, wealth sharing, transitional arrangements, and then the whole matter about normalization, which would include your typical components about what to do with the weapons and the combatants. And because this was precisely taking time, both parties actually felt that we should start implementing some of the elements, even as we were still negotiating, the finer details of the shape of the powers, the shape, and so on, the institutional design of the prospective autonomous government.
Now, you mentioned part of your preparations as well was sort of the relationship building and trust building. What efforts were made to do that? It's not an easy thing to accomplish, but what can you do in that regard?
Well, there were several levels to do that. Of course, the most important level was that they see the right signals from the one who will be making the real decisions, and that will be the president. And in fact, the president was very smart about it as well when he actually thought about meeting with the chair of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. This has never been done before, to meet face to face and to sort of like get to know each other. And when that was offered to them, they had a long meeting about it. Their central committee had a long meeting about it. And then they came back to us and said that they actually appreciated the gesture, that the president would like to meet with them. And though we had some difficulty in the logistics of that meeting, we had actually wanted it to be done inside the country, but they felt that there was no safe place within the country for their leader. Then we actually had to do it in Japan, and we had to arrange that with the Japanese government, but it turned out very well, and it provided that kind of assurance that this president is really going to be serious about these negotiations. So it's a two-way thing, and of course, on the government side, they wanted the same signals coming from the other side. notably showing real intent to do something about stopping the rise of radical Islam within their scope of influence, to make sure that they do not provide sanctuary to some of the jihadist cells that have actually entered the country way back in the 1990s, starting with Al-Qaeda and Jamaat Islamiyah, the regional variant here in Southeast Asia, and basically up to now with some of the ISIS cells being formed in the region. So that was the kind of goodwill that we wanted to see from them. And they did show that. They did show that through different means as well. One was that they made a categorical statement denouncing terrorism, denouncing terrorist acts. They even wrote the US president to proclaim that they do not support, after 9/11, for example, that they do not support terrorism, and saying that they are not a terrorist organization. That they're in a sense, yes, they are guerrilla. They are largely, they're old school revolutionary movements, not the kind of jihadist cell ways that the current groups operate through bombings. But certainly there were some excesses as well. But in any case, they eventually flushed out some of these people from the areas that they have significant presence and control. And to a certain extent, that also provided some level of trust on the part of our security sector, who precisely wanted to see that kind of security cooperation taking shape with this purportedly moderate Islamic group against, the more serious threat of radical Islam really getting foothold on in the south of the Philippines.
Have you given that any thought before? I mean, you had some very specific examples of what they had done to build that you felt built trust. Was that something that registered in the moment, or have you thought of this afterwards? Or
no, it was sort of part of we were trying to solve a problem. The problem, of course, had to do with the legitimate claims, which you acknowledge, of that kind of history of discrimination, marginalization. Government was already there acknowledging that. But at the same time, government was faced precisely with all of the other security issues. So that sort of, and part of the reason that it saw to its interest building that peace with the moderate Islamic movement is precisely to shut the doors to the more serious threats that was already evident way back by the turn of the century, right? It was already on our shores. And so that was sort of in the consciousness. And it was something that was expected of us as the one facing them, to sort of process these things with them. So that was one part of the equation. But the bigger part really was to find just solution to this historical conflict, because that's what they wanted, and anything short of that would not have led to an agreement.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the power imbalance there of you're negotiating on behalf of a government against a minority? What were the effects of that power imbalance, and any suggestions on how to address that?
Yes, it was an asymmetrical conflict in the sense that, of course, the state is bigger, it has a bigger army. But on the other hand, it was also true that they were very much located in their own communities, concentrated in very specific areas, so that any fighting actually displaces a large number of people, and that creates a big strain on the social welfare services, for instance, having to do with large displacements in these areas. I think the one advantage of the fact that this has been a long process that took 17 years to complete, with on and off negotiations, ceasefires breaking down, ceasefire being reinstalled. It meant also that the MILF had sufficient time to be to be engaged by the international community, and I think this was quite important in the sense that they actually facilitated some of the exposure of the MILF to other peace processes to sort of provide some inspiration on how some things could be done, and basically to know how things were negotiated. So if there was like some imbalance in that sense on some of the know-how relating to negotiations and all the political, social, economic issues that were part of the agenda, that was sort of like some assistance was provided for that by the international community. In fact, we also got some assistance along that line. For instance, Spain organized a visit for us to look at the arrangements, the national, subnational arrangements on all different levels between the autonomous kingdoms and Madrid, for instance, even on some very basic things like taxation and so on. And that sort of helped us, give us also ideas. But basically for them, since we had all the technical know-how, the government was the one, how to be able to cope with all of these negotiating issues. I think it was very important that they got that kind of support from the international community in the form of comparative learning that was facilitated by different countries and different international NGOs who were accompanying the whole process. So, but in terms of the actual negotiations, in terms of the power imbalance, I think there were some basic things that we also learned from other processes, and that is basically that the party that is aggrieved, right? And in this sense, they are the aggrieved party, having felt that oppression, will naturally tend to be more very insistent on some of on their own positions. They will be talking about their history again and again. So you will get a lot of these lectures on history, something that we've heard maybe 100 times. I'm exaggerating, of course, but something that we've already studied and prepared for, actually, and already taken some of these things from, in fact, their own perspective, so that we can better, communicate with them. In the course of a negotiation, we will get a lot of these emotional outbursts, but our attitude has always been, yes, they have been keeping these emotions for the longest time. And so really, it was very important for us to be able to maintain our equanimity, to stay cool, for instance, in moments of outburst, and also to be conscious of buttons that create this kind of emotional outburst. So it did require significant sensitivity, maybe cultural sensitivity, but basically humane sensitivity to some of these things that are really, really very important for them, and which we needed to treat with utmost care. So, for instance, anything about identity, anything about culture, history, these are the foundations, the whole foundation of their ideology, the otherness that they have felt from the majority, for instance, or from the Philippine state in particular, that allowed the negotiations to suffer less from breakdowns and unhealthy relationships.
That's pretty common of bringing up the past and all sorts of levels of different negotiations, whether family disputes or these sort of political disputes. And you're suggesting that learning the buttons and sort of avoiding them is one method. Do you have any other recommendations on like you're at the table, and you're having these repetitive stories come up and claims, like, do you just take them on board, and like how do you keep the focus on the future and moving forward in those instances?
Well, sometimes having these plenary discussions really wasn't working. I mean, you see that when discussions are going around in circles, when there is like a higher intensity of emotions across the table, then it doesn't really make sense to continue the discussion at the plenary level. And that's why along the way, we actually utilize different levels of different kinds of tables, you may say. There will be like smaller tables where what we call the 1+1, where only the chairs together with the facilitator, so that's 1+1 equals 3 actually, together with the facilitator discussing some of the more difficult issues, sort of to level off without the kind of performative character that you have in a big room, right? Because it was a big room. I mean, there were 6 of us, 6 of them. We had behind us our secretariat, which was quite, I mean, maybe 5 to 6 or even 7. And then behind us were the people from the International Contact Group. We had 4 international NGOs and 4 governments who were observing the process. And at the center was the facilitator, and behind the facilitator was his secretariat made up of around 5 people. And that's a big room. So when you're discussing in a big room, it takes on the character of a theater. And sometimes you get, it's not a very quick way, or it's not even a very healthy way when people need to perform before a large group and not really just, talk on the various essence or the essential things that you need to sort out. Or at least sort of level off at one level at a smaller group, and then sort of process that within the bigger group. So there will be those kinds of meetings, and sometimes there will be parallel meetings, in fact. So we did create technical working groups on the 4 annexes that was part of the agenda. And there will be simultaneous meetings and a lot of back and forth. And then breaks were actually not just about taking refreshments or sitting down and relaxing. Breaks were actually very constructive moments too, when a lot of shuttling could go back through the third parties present, because the MILF was sort of very strict in not talking directly to each other during the negotiations. Everything had to be facilitated, I think they were also doing it for their own protection. They didn't want to be accused of making deals outside of the party, outside of the team, and also not to have these kind of shortcuts that might create loss of confidence. So a lot of these things, the shuttling was facilitated as well by the members of the International Contact Group. Especially during these breaks when we were trying to sort out some of the issues. So it was really trying to see what modality, what format would work best, would facilitate the work. Simultaneous technical working groups, or maybe just smaller groups. Sometimes it's 2+2, 2 people from each party, or even 3+3, but not the whole contingent. So it needed that kind of wisdom on everybody's part, including the facilitator, to recommend when a situation is no longer tenable or is no longer productive and must therefore be changed into some other format. And a facilitator could make that call, or any of the chairs could make that call. So, but of course, you can't sort of do it all the time, because you might be losing a dynamism that could already lead you to some kind of resolution by calling for a break, right? So it does require also that kind of very good sense of when to actually change the format that you are in.
Yeah, a lot of interesting dynamics there, especially the observers. To what extent would you say the actual progress was made at the smaller tables and even the breaks compared to the actual discussions at the main the theater, as you might describe it? Do you think you could quantify that? Like, could you take a guess of what sort of progress would be made?
I mean, these are really specific issues that you need to sort out. But at the end of the day, nothing is agreed until it's done at the plenary, right?
Right.
So it's really processing, and then it's exploring alternatives, or maybe even texts that we're passing or we're exchanging with them. And in one instance, in fact, it wasn't done in the formal meeting setup. It was done in Mindanao, where the facilitator actually shuttled from between their camp and the hotel where the previous government chair, for example, my colleague, who is now a member of the Supreme Court, was seated. So it did take on different forms. I think at that time, the message was the formal table isn't really working. So I think we need to sort out some of the stumbling blocks before we get back to the formal table. Yeah. And that's a kind of modality. So and that's why the formal meetings can actually be in between 2 or 3 months. But during those 3 months, these kinds of, the facilitator shuttling between the parties and a lot of other interlocutors, self-appointed interlocutors, as well as the official observers, they will be shuttling back and forth. I mean, sometimes you have this flurry of activity going on in between the actual formal meetings. So, I mean, the action doesn't just happen at the formal table, it happens every step of the way.
Yeah. The facilitator, what would you describe their role in, like, perhaps could you compare it to a mediator? Is it pretty much a similar role they're taking there? Or?
No, government was very conscious not to call Malaysia, the representative of Malaysia, a mediator, on the assumption that the mediator actually comes forward with solutions and so on. And in fact, in other processes, the mediator's team actually produces the draft. And we didn't want anything like that. No submissions coming from the third parties. We didn't feel that they understood our concern. And in any case, it might might have too many texts on the table. So that was one of our ground rules. No text coming from the third party, the facilitator, or even the international contact group. Although they did try, but we sort of said, no way, please don't pass around text. The only texts that are to be passed around are between us, those that came from them and that came from us. So a facilitator is sort of less intrusive less intrusive in the process, may informally make proposals, but not in the sense that a mediator has for perhaps a bigger mandate, but it's really a porous line, and it really depends on the comfort levels of the negotiating parties as to how far a third-party facilitator/mediator will go. To a certain extent, the facilitator from Malaysia was crossing the line sometimes as mediator. But yeah, we give spaces for that. If it's helping the situation, then why not? But otherwise, we will just say, frankly, that maybe that shouldn't be done or something like that.
Okay. I want to shift gears here. You're commonly referred to as the first ever female chief negotiator to sign a final peace agreement with a rebel group. And that's a big deal. Can you talk about what sort of challenges you faced as being a woman in this role, or if any, or and how you overcame them if you did face?
Right. Oh, well, maybe this is something that's been asked a lot. So,
right.
But because the thing is, 21st century, and this is the first time it happened. That's really terrible, isn't it? And what does that tell us about the gender imbalance in the politics, in world politics, or domestic politics for that matter? But the point is, it did become an obstacle in the beginning. It was deemed problematic that a new chair, who was a woman, will be appointed to become the chair. There was some resistance to it. There was some hesitation on the part of the president, the appointing authority, not because he didn't appreciate what women can do. In fact, he had a lot of women in his cabinet, but he feared that an Islamic group would not be ready for that situation. And he didn't want, he wanted the process to succeed. And he took the risk, right? On the insistence of his cabinet advisor on the peace process, another woman, that the best person to do this job at this moment is really this woman, right? So I was taking over as from the position of my colleague. I was already part of the team, but that the chair was going to go to the Supreme Court, and I was sort of the senior member there, and it was natural, except for the fact that I was a woman, that I take over the post. But in any case, that was done. There was some resistance. It was something new to them. It wasn't something new to me. I've been working with men and women throughout my life, but for them, in the public sphere has been largely dominated. I mean, almost basically men in the public sphere. And along the way, I think the whole idea for us, and we did have a lot of women in our team. Eventually, there were 3 women in our panel. 3 out of 6 were women. And we had our head of secretariat, many of our young lawyers, they were all women. So what we did bring to the table was a process of normalizing the presence of women in a political negotiation process. It was not about one person chairing the panel, but it was crucial in the sense that the chair does play a significant leading role. But it was about this trying to normalize the presence, participation, and leadership position of women in a political process. And I think that's what we were able to achieve in this process. And unfortunately, you don't see that. You don't see that in a lot of processes. Yet, where you do have a significant presence of women, not the majority, because the other side was eventually conceded to bring only 1 or 2 women into their team. But in any case, it was a breakthrough because they've been negotiating for more than 10 years and they never had women in their team. But part of the pressure was on them from the domestic civil society as well as international NGOs, was for them to bring in some women, and they did that. In the beginning, they said, well, we cannot change the composition of our panel because our panel is already representative of the different ethnic groups, but they all happen to be men. So the only way that we can bring in the women was to enlarge the room, for put in more seats inside the room in the form of consultants. And when we created the technical working groups, we actually brought in more women, and they brought in maybe just another woman. So in all, they would have basically 1 or 2 women in the process. In our case, 3 out of 4 of our technical working groups were chaired by women, and these were women who were executive in their field, like the National Security Council. The one that dealt with the security issue was represented by the undersecretary from our National Security Council. The woman who headed our wealth sharing annex, he was a regional director of our Economic Development Authority. And with her was the director of the Tax Bureau, which is very important because a lot of the issues had to do with revenue sharing as part of drawing up the terms for fiscal autonomy. And I think that's what the process did. Now, how did that affect the kind of dynamics, the gender dynamics within the Bangsamoro community? I would think that is still evolving. It's still a slow process, but it really sort of, at that point, it sort of created an impetus to make visible the gender question in relation not only to the question of, the relationship between a majority and a minority population, but the relationship between men and women was also made some kind of an underlying, subtext, some kind of a subtext in the whole process.
That's great. Yeah, a great spark for hopefully more lasting change as well, although a slow one, as you mentioned. Just shifting gears here again, after such a complex and groundbreaking in terms of inclusivity, Did your view or understanding of negotiation prior to entering these discussions change in any way by the end?
Mm, I'm not sure if I had very strong assumptions when I started. It's you play things by ear, but you are, of course, guided by certain principles that you hold dear. I think me personally, for instance, what I felt wrong about the previous process was that part of it was built on some kind of a patronage relationship between the central government and the leaders of the armed group, in this case, the older MNLF. And what we didn't want to see was to build a relationship based on patronage, because that wouldn't really transform the situation. I think really what was good about the whole context on the government side was that, for instance, the government itself was led by a president who really wanted to reform the politics of the country. But also you will find that in our team, we were not made up of ambassadors or generals as most government negotiating teams are. And even the earlier ones, the earlier negotiating teams, who were scholars. We had an Islamic jurisprudence scholar with us who could talk to them in Islamic terms. And that was very effective, especially when he talked about gender relations from an progressive Islamic perspective. He made more impact than if we had to do it ourselves, right, as women. And then we had people coming from civil society, plus, of course, some of the government officials, but they brought in this kind of, more reformist agenda. So it meant, for instance, that the whole negotiation was built on really creating a just solution and transforming the situation. That was very important. I think that was a very important guideline for our negotiation. But did that change my previous perspective? I think in a sense it allowed me to really put in practice what I felt the negotiation should be about. I mean, before I was in civil society following the negotiations, giving critique, and also doing some of this, advising on the side. But now, in that sense, you can have that kind of a very good comprehensive framework and empowering framework in place. But otherwise, on basic negotiating skills, I wasn't trained. I wasn't a trained negotiator. I mean, we had some trainings. We had John Paul Lederach, for instance, coming in, doing some trainings. I attended some. I went to Uppsala on the peace and conflict resolution training, but not in terms of really formal training or even real career as a negotiator before. But at the end of the day, you sort of get into that and your different personalities bring it together. And I think what was good about our team was that we had very good teamwork. I mean, we could play bad cop, good cop. We rehearse our strategies. We assign certain roles based on what we think the impact will be on the other side. One person will be assigned to pursue this. We gave signals to each other if we think that somebody, including myself, might be going too far. We sort of have some signals under the table, like kicking the foot or just making hand signals to sort of say, maybe you should tone down a little, or maybe you should drop the issue and come back to it. And there will be some papers passing around reminding each other about certain things that we need to follow up. And this is all part of the teamwork that was very important to be able to keep the process healthy.
Yeah. How important is it to have a team that's clicking? And did you find there was any issues or a lot of friction in your group? And how did you work as a team? How did you overcome obstacles and collaborate? And can you speak to the importance of the team for a moment?
I think one is, of course, the composition. So how do you maximize the composition so that what you have would be some kind of a very good range of people coming in, not only in terms of expertise, but also personality styles. Like I said, we had an Islamic scholar, and we had people who were academics, and people who were down on the ground in the situation, and then the people who were within the government bureaucracy. So that's a fairly good range of people. I think I would say that the fact that we were academics meant that we really had a good understanding of the question of the whole problem, because this was something that we had been doing for the longest time, in terms of really studying and following the issue and getting the different narratives and seeing through the narratives in a sense. The team, the composition it's really good to think about the composition of the team. I mean, maybe on their part, they thought about representation, right? Because the Bangsamoro is not a monolithic entity. It's made up of different ethno-linguistic groups with different languages and spread out. Even within one region, there are islands, and there are those in the bigger region, Mindanao continent, if you will call it like that. But there's an archipelago part to it. So it was very important to to compose a team on their end that represented that kind of multi-ethnic character of their cause, right? On our end, it was that kind of social network and expertise that we were able to put together. And it was very important that we did a lot of strategizing, and that we had a lot of young people. You know, they were older people, mostly, because they have been fighting since the late 60s, early 70s. They were the fighters that belonged to that generation. But in our team, we had people in their 30s, people in their 20s. Mm-hmm. And that created the dynamism, and it meant that they could work very well with say, at the secretariat level, although a little bit older, maybe people in their 30s and 40s on the other side, but they could jive very well with their counterparts on the other side at that level. And those informal, conversations that goes around, this help you get a better understanding of really why things are happening the way they are, especially if they're not happening. I mean, things are turning out not quite well. That kind of feedback system that you get through these different levels of conversation that goes around, it helps you process things better. And if you are processing things better, then you can define your strategies better as well.
Yeah. You mentioned the Islamic scholar. What considerations, or what would you recommend to take into consideration when addressing religion in political conflict?
This was, of course, a case where the other party is Islamic, and Islam was part of their ideology. Although basically they were ethno-nationalists, but Islam was part of their identity. So it was very important that we had people who were knowledgeable about that, because there were actually some negotiating issues that had references to Islam. So we had an expert in our team who would know about it and be able to discourse it with the other party effectively, very effectively, and also with us, so that we could really understand the dynamics of it, or the whole concept behind certain Islamic practices, as well as say Islamic institutions that they wanted to Islamic inspired institutions that they wanted to introduce as part of the political design, the institutional design of the autonomous government. So that I think that was crucial. We couldn't, but that was not only about religion. It was also about the culture, particular culture of the certain communities there. Like there were certain nuances that was quite different in terms of how they actually say things. So we had to read how they were actually framing things. We had to read behind the lines. So it was very good also that we had people in our team who belonged to the same communities, because then they would understand even some of the social practices or maybe some of the social sensitivities on how things should be done. We got guidance from that from people who belong to these communities.
Right on. Very important, the cultural piece. So I know you teach a graduate level course at the University of Philippines on discourse analysis. Can you describe what discourse analysis is and maybe give some tips on how mediators or negotiators can apply it? It's a big one. We don't have too much time here, but,
Right. But
yeah, crash course.
But in negotiations, part of the preparation is really this conflict analysis. Conflict analysis, you look at actors, you look at arm strength, etc., etc. But I think at the end of the day, those quantitative figures do matter, especially when you're talking about decommissioning of weapons and combatants. But otherwise, to get to the root of the problem, it's really their narrative that you must read. It's how they are actually framing their issues and how you can get into that frame and be able to significantly put in some of your frames into it, your party's frames into it, rather than just simply imposing your frame on them, right? I mean, the best way to be understood by them, in fact, is to use their own language, is to use their own stories, because then they connect more easily. But if you don't know that, if you don't know how they are referencing things and putting it in this grand narrative with all its particularities, then you don't see the nuances, or they feel that you are not understanding them, or that they will feel that you're ignorant even of where they're coming from, right? But there has to be a sense from the other side that you understand them. And to understand them, it's not so much about how many arms they have, how many combatants they have, their areas of influence. To understand them is to understand their story. I think that's what discourse analysis, both as an analytical framework as well as as a theoretical or philosophical framework, it points us in that kind of a direction. That the need to understand the narrative, the story of the other, and then to look, to critically examine this discourse and to find your openings there.
Doesn't sound like a simple undertaking. We talk about reframing a lot, but this is understanding their frame, their narrative first and foremost, and I guess expressing that understanding. Then are you making efforts to shift the frame, or I think you might have mentioned entering the frame? Could you just expand on that a little bit?
You enter and point out where commonalities are to be able to have something shared. But of course, there are gaps, right? There are differences. So this frame should not be kept static. It should keep moving. Part of the readiness, in fact, of any party to go into negotiations is the kind of openness, the openness to let go of some of the elements that are part of this big frame, without losing some of the fundamentals. I think some of the fundamentals that you hold dear, which eventually might be shared, actually. So, for instance, what fundamentals did we share with them? One is that they have the right to their own identity, which they wanted to call the Bangsamoro identity, and that was very crucial for them. They had the right to self-determination, but not independence. So these are certain fundamentals. But how would that look like in terms of a government institution, a government, in terms of a regional government in this sense? That's when you get into the devils of the details. And that's where you actually get into a lot of entanglements. But if you already have the fundamentals acknowledged on both sides, on our side, we wanted the acknowledgement, maybe not necessarily articulated in the text, the acknowledgement that we are constrained to work within the framework of our Constitution, that we cannot go beyond our Constitution, and that the government has to think of the interests of the whole and not just of one particular segment. That that at the end of the day, this should not be an agreement just between the two of us, but with the whole country, because otherwise it would not succeed. So these are some of the fundamentals that both parties had to mutually acknowledge. Then you go into the devils of the detail.
Interesting. Thanks for just a brief summary of discourse analysis. I think that's an interesting topic. It'd be great to unpack that more, but I know it's getting late there. I just want to wrap up with whether you have any final tips for negotiators or mediators, just any thoughts.
Let me see. Well, perhaps I think you know the basics taught in trainings, right? I don't know. I can't pick a single one, but maybe the challenge that we are facing now is for processes that are more inclusive, for instance. And on that point, really, there must be an attempt to have a more inclusive process. It's not always perfect. It's not always like you achieve everything 100% from the very beginning. But one must always find a way that as you go from one step to another, find more of these spaces where you can actually make your process more and more inclusive. I mean, you can't have it in one go, like designing your negotiating team or your process design and think that you'll have everything in place in your process design from the very beginning of a negotiation. No, that doesn't happen. But you must continue to look for those spaces as you go along the way. Now, to be concrete, for instance, once you start discussing your implementing mechanisms, then you're creating new structures. And there you try to move and bring, say, more women, more civil society, more community people into the picture. Even though you didn't have it in the beginning, I mean, you should continue to try where those spaces can be occupied by the other stakeholders. So you can't be dogmatic about it, but you must be conscious and must be creative in trying to find opportunities for a more inclusive process.
Okay, inclusivity early on, but all through the process as well. That's great. I know it's late there, so we'll wrap up, but I want to thank you so much for sharing, bringing us behind the scenes of that historic negotiation and sharing a lot of useful tips along the way. So thanks again.
Okay, I'm sorry if I actually take a long time to answer each of your questions.
No, details are good. As you said, the devil's in the details, right?
All right, the angels.
They're the angels. Right on.
All right.
Thanks
Okay,
so
Warren.
much.
Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more from international experts digging into a range of topics on conflict, power, and persuasion, subscribe to your favorite podcast app or visit us at cien.org. That's CIIAN.org.